Bullying, something we've all encountered, whether we were the victim, a bystander, or if we were the bullies ourselves. Bullying has been and continues to be a pervasive part of our society, one that has been ignored for many years. So what did it take for this issue to come to the forefront? We'll argue today that this happened in large part because of cases like that of Phoebe Prince. In January of 2010, 15-year-old Phoebe Prince committed suicide after suffering months of bullying by classmates in South Hadley, Massachusetts. She moved to the U.S. in 2009 from Ireland, where she was reported to suffer from emotional and psychological problems. Phoebe was repeatedly bullied because of her brief relationships with a few boys at the school. She was called an Irish slut and a whore, over and over again. We chose the Phoebe Prince case because it shows just how complex the issue of bullying is. Finding solutions, doubly so. Throughout the course of this presentation, we challenge you to flip the schema. Push yourself to think not only from the perspective of the bullied, but from the perspective of the bully as well. Challenge the images presented in the media. What if Phoebe Prince had not been of foreign descent? What if she had been a girl of color? What if she had been a young man or of a different sexual orientation? Who is really to blame? Looking past the surface is the only way we can begin to address the bullying issue on all levels. And with that said, I'll turn it over to our historians to define bullying.
So while the behaviors that we now consider bullying have a long association with human interactions, the recognition of bullying as a distinct phenomenon is actually only something, it's actually a fairly recent innovation. Prior to the mid-19th century, bullying wasn't associated with the sort of aggressive and harassing behavior we think of today. And in fact, in its original usage, the word bully meant friend. The kinds of behavior that we think of bullying today were more generally just considered teasing or fighting. By the mid-19th century, however, we begin to see a usage of the term bullying that's more akin to modern understanding. In newspapers, the term bully was applied to individuals that sought out or caused fights. The bullies referred to, however, at least initially, were exclusively male. And it's also important to note that bullying was initially associated strictly with acts of physical violence, and acts like manslaughter or stabbing, things that go well beyond like what we think of as bullying today. By the turn of the 20th century, bullying amongst children, male and female, was recognized as a distinct phenomenon. Juvenile bullying, however, tended not to be regarded as a serious problem, and instead it was treated sort of as a ubiquitous aspect of adolescent life. The view of bullying that prevailed in media and movies was one that focused on a victim's response to bullying. These sorts of narratives tended to relieve bullies of responsibility for their actions, and they encouraged victims to stand up to bullies and often to respond with physical aggression. An emerging field of psychological and sociological research into bullying in the 1980s and 1990s challenged our traditional views of youth bullying. We began to recognize that the non-physical aspects of bullying, emotional bullying, were as serious as the physical aspects. The shootings at Columbine in 1999 and the recent emergence of cyberbullying have also challenged what we think of as bullying, who bullies are, who victims are, and how we should respond to it. And we can see these changes in our thinking reflected in popular culture.
Incoming! Hey, watch it, Dale! Oh.
I wouldn't mind talking to the Geek Squad.
Aren't you in the wrong section? Losers are to the left. Hey, I'm talking to you, McFly, you Irish bug.
Oh, hey, Biff. Hey, guys. How are you doing?
Yeah, you got my homework finished, McFly?
Well, actually, I figured since it wasn't due till Monday.
Hello? Hello? Anybody home? Hey, think, McFly, think.
What do you let those boys push you around like that for?
Well, they're bigger than me.
Stand tall, boy. Have some respect for yourself. Don't you know if you let people walk over you now, they'll be walking over you for the rest of your life.
When I tell you to come, you better come. What, are you gonna cry now? Come on, cry, baby, cry for me. Come on, cry.
Deep in the recesses of my brain, a tiny red-hot little flame began to grow. Something had happened. A fuse blew, and I had gone out of my skull.
The next step is full-scale psychological warfare, right? You gotta act like you got this tick, right? Like the army did this experiment on you, right? That just went terribly wrong. You're like, back up! Back up! Mind your business, that's all. Mind your business.
Okay. Back up! Back up! Mind your business, that's all. Just mind your business.
Yeah, well, read this.
Knock it off, or I shall be forced to respond in kind.
Looking back at the incident, the massacre opened the door about much national and international debate in regard to gun violence and bullying. HowToStopBullying.com reports that 77% of students are bullied mentally, verbally and physically. In addition, 30% of US students are involved in moderate or frequent bullying. Each day, 160,000 students miss school for fear of being bullied, and 28% of students carry with them some sort of a weapon.
Do not hang out with her. Why? Oh, you don't want me to tell you. Oh, you can tell me. Hold on. Oh my god, she's so annoying. Who is? Who's this? Gretchen? Right. Hold on. Oh my god, she's so annoying.
I know, just get rid of her.
Okay, what is it? Regina says everyone hates you because you're such a slut. She said that? You didn't hear it from me. It's Monday.
So?
So that's against the rules, and you can't sit with us.
Whatever. Those rules aren't real.
They were real that day I wore a vest.
Because that vest was disgusting.
You can't sit with us!
These sweatpants are all that fits me right now. Fine. You can walk home, bitches.
That's where you're going, fat ass.
But you all have got to stop calling each other sluts and whores. It just makes it okay for guys to call you sluts and whores. Who here has ever been called a slut?
New virus, unlike any other, has infiltrated schools through social media. A pandemic quickly spreading around the world.
Perkins boy, just 11 years old, believed to have been desperate enough to take his own life.
This is an awfully complicated and difficult issue.
Kids will be kids, boys will be boys. They're just cruel at this age.
Here what we get is nothing's wrong, we didn't do anything, everything's fine.
They punch me, strangle me, take things from me, sit on me.
Give it to him hard!
He's not safe on that bus.
I've been on that bus. They are just as good as gold.
Okay, so hopefully that gave you a good sense of sort of the shift in perspective about bullying. And so now with that, we're going to shift to our internal and external situationist.
Okay, so knowing briefly some of the facts of the Phoebe Prince case, as Victoria introduced, what we did is we tried to look at how cognitive psychology could give us a better understanding of each of the relevant actors in bullying scenarios. So we basically broke it down into 3 buckets: the bully, the victim, and the bystanders. And we're going to sort of just go through each one in turn. So with the bully, the first thing that we want to stress is that there really are there are a number of factors that could possibly influence why bullies behave the way they do. One study that does a particularly good job at this was one by Iowa State University Professor Douglas Gentile, where he identified 6 different risk factors. So the factors were low parental involvement, exposure to violence in the media, prior physical victimization, previous fights, bias towards hostility, and gender. And through his study, what he was able to show was not only did each individual factor help predict whether or not there would be future aggressive behavior, but when multiple factors were present, that compounded the risk of future aggressive behavior. So in this chart on the bottom right, you can see when 5 factors were present, you could predict future aggressive behavior with almost 84% accuracy. So that's sort of a stunning finding, especially for thinking about how to make policy and some of the factors that you might want to take into consideration. And then the next thing we looked at was how specifically neural pathways might also explain some of the behavior. So one study by psychologists at the University of Chicago took brain scans of participants with aggressive conduct disorder and participants without it, and exposed them to visual stimuli, videos of people being placed in situations of pain or going through just everyday activities. So you have here somebody getting their hand slammed in a car door, and somebody just opening their trunk. And basically what they found was participants with conduct disorder actually reacted differently to these visual stimuli. Particularly, there was more activity going on in regions of the brain like the amygdala, which are typically associated with pleasure and reward. So this lends to the idea that bullies may in fact get pleasure out of seeing others in pain. So that's also something to take into consideration when explaining this behavior. And then the last line of research, which is particularly relevant for the Phoebe Prince case, is what some people have termed the online disinhibition effect. This is really important for cyberbullying and the way that people use communication nowadays to say things that they wouldn't otherwise say in normal face-to-face conversation. So psychologist John Suler identifies six aspects of the online disinhibition effect. I'm not going to go through all of them, but real quick, I mean, they're fairly intuitive, but dissociative anonymity and invisibility are the first two. And those basically go to the idea that when you're communicating online, you're anonymous, you're invisible, you're empowered to say things that normally you might be embarrassed to say, or you wouldn't say face-to-face, but you'd say online. Asynchronicity is another one, and that goes to the idea that there's a timing disjoint between what you're posting online and the responses that you get. You have the power to go online, make a comment, and you may never even need to return to see how people are going to respond to that, or you might not even give people the opportunity to respond to that. Whereas in person, you say something and immediately there's a response. And then I'm just going to go to the last one, which is minimizing authority. And that's the idea that online everybody is equal. So the power dynamics that exist in face-to-face interactions lose their meaning online. And then you can see some of the quotations from the Phoebe Prince case that were posted on Facebook. And I think it's easy to see how some of these were enabled through these points.
All right, so next we're going to move on to the psychology of the bullied. This is actually where a lot of the research and studies have been kind of focused, are on the effects in behavior and the effects in mental effects, and the effects in how the bullied mentally perform, and then also the effects in how they psychologically and behaviorally perform. So first, we're going to look at the victim's mental effects of bullying, and those often manifest in increased risks of depression, anxiety, and chronic illness. This has been shown time and time again in study. As you can see from this quote up here, which I won't read out loud, a lot of times the bullying actually increases chemicals in the brain that make individuals susceptible to physical illness, which also contributes to later truancy that shows up in behavior. So children not only want to miss school because they're being bullied, but because they're actually getting sick from being bullied. And this is something that's been researched and studied and proven on a variety of different fronts. Also, the heightened stress, which we just covered, chronic nightmares have been shown to show up in children who are severely bullied, and also concentration deficiencies. So people who are bullied often can't focus in class because they're thinking about the fear and danger of being bullied. It's actually interesting in the Phoebe Prince case because she, of course, went into this situation with a history of depression, and that's been interesting in how folks then tend to characterize her. That goes into situation dispositionism. I found an article in which someone was talking about why there should not be any sort of action around the Phoebe Prince case because, as she stated, if you commit a murder, you don't get to say, oh, well, people made my life hell and I had a reason to do it. You're still a murderer. The people who made your life difficult, they didn't kill you. You killed yourself. So this whole depression phenomenon that either feeds into the psychology of the bullied and in itself is created by the bullying, it really is often dispositionalized, and that can have some severe negative effects. So next to the behavioral effects, which I kind of briefly touched on because they really go hand in hand. It's decreased academic performance, a lot of that from the loss of concentration. Then truancy, caused both from fear and from the general sickness that's caused by the stress, and then an increased likelihood to experiment with alcohol. And these are all symptoms that not only are on the short term, but then also continue on to the long term. There have been a variety of studies that, with varying degrees of frequency, have shown that this will carry on into college and then oftentimes into the workplace. Not only will the bullied experience low self-esteem, experience these symptoms in college, they can often make themselves more vulnerable to being bullied later on when they're adults.
Thank you. Okay, so quickly, so I'm going to talk about the bystander and how bystanders play into this effect. So the public nature of the Phoebe Prince case meant that a lot of people were exposed to this bullying. So there are parents, there are students, there are teachers. And studies have shown that a bystander can intervene and really impact the bullying. They can stop the bullying completely by speaking up or stepping up. And there are other studies that show that the bystanders really feel the effects of the bullying almost as much and sometimes equally as much as the actual victim is feeling. So the question that I'm going to ask is, so if bystanders are feeling the effects and they can make a huge impact on the bullying, why aren't people stepping up? So we can go to the next slide. There's three main psychological effects I'm going to talk about quickly. So social proof, groupthink, and the bystander effect. And these effects, they're interrelated, but they're slightly different in different ways. So I'm going to talk first about social proof. So social proof describes that when we're uncertain how to act, we look to other people to determine our own behavior. So we sort of ping off the group. And in this picture, everyone's looking up. So there's like a study where someone will stand on the sidewalk and be looking up in the sky, and people walking by will see that, and they'll sort of look up in the same way. And if you put 3 people standing there, it's definitely you're going to look up and wonder what people are looking at. I think LSAO knows, we kind of wonder what other people are looking at. And there's another case where they'll have people in an elevator standing the wrong way, and so the person will walk in and sort of see that and stand with the group the wrong way. So when especially in times when we're uncertain what to do, we use each other to determine our own behavior. So you can think in the bullying circumstance, when someone's being bullied, if no one else is acting, you can look to the other people in the group to justify your own inaction. And so the next, groupthink. Groupthink is a sort of similar concept in that we want to maintain the group's cohesiveness. So in this, this sort of illustrates it. All in favor say aye, and sorry, it's getting cut off in the bottom here, but everyone is thinking no, but they're all going to say aye to maintain the group cohesiveness and the group harmony. So in the bullying example, it sort of takes a certain amount of risk to sort of step out and sort of break that cohesive group that isn't intervening. So those two sort of feed into the bystander effect. So I'm going to show a quick video that really illustrates this. And they're sort of, you can hear these and you can sort of intellectually or logically understand that people won't intervene, but I think it's important.
And this next story is difficult to watch, even tougher to believe.
Jumped again a little bit on that one. I just want to say there's some explicit things in this video. If you have sort of maybe a sensitive disposition, I guess you could say, you might want to just listen to the video. But I think it's important to experience it firsthand to really understand the effects of the bystander effect. So now you can fire away.
And this next story is difficult to watch, even tougher to believe. A good Samaritan on the streets of New York City sees someone in distress and steps in to help, but when he becomes the victim for helping, no one steps up for him, with tragic consequences. Global National's Paul Johnson has the story, and a warning, some viewers may find the pictures disturbing.
Police say he was a good Samaritan. 31-year-old Hugo Tailed Yaks, stabbed as he tried to protect a woman from a mugger. This surveillance tape shows him bleeding to death on the sidewalk as 25 people passed him by. In that hour and 20 minutes, one man takes a cell phone picture, another actually lifts his body, sees the blood, and walks away. By the time paramedics got there, it was too late.
Anybody that would do that and just leave him there to die, that's no morals, no morals, no conscience.
Shocking, but hardly uncommon. In Hartford, Connecticut, a 78-year-old man who was hit by a car died after countless others passed him by. A patient who collapsed in the waiting room of this New York psych ward was left face down for an hour before she died, with staff and other patients looking on.
A lot of you are probably thinking, not me. If I saw something like that happening, I would jump in and help. But statistically speaking, you wouldn't, especially if there were a lot of other people around.
There's an assumption that someone else must be helping out. We're motivated to try to fit into our social environment. We're influenced by others. We want to do what others do. Our behavior will follow.
It's known as the bystander effect. The more people present, the less likely anyone will step forward and do something. The stabbing murder of Kitty Genovese in New York in 1964 is one of the most famous examples. But in 2002, Canadians were horrified by the murder of Brianne Voth early one morning in Port Coquitlam. Some neighbors who heard her screams didn't call 911. Actual Good Samaritans are rarer than you'd think. And last week in New York, Hugo Tail-Yaks seems to have been the only one who deserved that title. Paul Johnson, Global News, Washington.
So I thought that this gentleman's reaction was quite interesting. It sort of reminded me of the dispositionist reactions to the McDonald's case. And it's sort of my gut reaction. How could someone not intervene and help? But I think sort of these different sort of social psychological principles can play into how sort of the internal situation can lead to our inability to intervene in these situations. And so the last slide, they talk about the Kitty Genovese case, and Sean will talk about it a little bit more, but she was a 28-year-old who was stabbed outside of an apartment complex, and she screamed for help, and it was reported that many of the people living in the apartment heard it, but no one called 911 because there was a diffusion of responsibility. So there's certain policy implications about bullying where we might want to make sure that there's a centralized place where they're in charge of trying to thwart bullying and make sure that one person's responsible so that they can act. So I think Sean will continue and give a little bit more information about this.
This will be the external situation as part of the presentation. There's a lot of different factors that kind of come into the external situation in bullying, but we chose to analyze just a few of those that we thought were the most prominent. And we decided to divide it into three categories: school officials, students, and parents. The idea being that these three pairs of groups are really kind of the significant groups that really impact how bullying works in the external environment. And then we looked at different effects, bystander effect, social identity theory, and so on, and then applied it sort of within the context of the Phoebe Prince case. So we'll start with school officials. And sort of jumping right off of what Michael was saying, so the bystander effect actually has a rather large implication, not only in terms of students, but also in terms of school officials. In the Phoebe Prince case, there's little to no evidence that the school had any sort of centralized bullying program. What we do know is that in the course of her experiences at that particular school, Phoebe Prince told an assistant principal, a gym teacher, another teacher, and a school nurse about what was going on. Each responded in their own way, but no one really put all the pieces together and kind of took the responsibility to resolve the situation in a way that was kind of final. And as a result of this diffusion of responsibility, everyone felt that someone else was probably taking care of it, with the tragic result that no one actually did. So one of the implications, as Michael kind of alluded to, is that schools might want to institute centralized bullying programs to be able to really kind of both centralize information, but also centralize responsibility and sort of take the sting out of the bystander effect. The other part of relating to school officials and why they're often seen as sort of, not negligence, probably the wrong word, but apathetic, is what we call the attribution through the lens of naive realism. And this is really a two-part thing. First, it's that a lot of attitudes, despite the shift that the historians kind of showed, there's still a very prevalent attitude in society that bullying is very much a physical thing. So 95% of adults think that if a student is being physically harmed, the school has to step in and act. But only 48% of adults thought that if a student was being isolated socially, that it was considered as bullying. And so this sort of, there's been an internalization of bullying as part of the school experience, at least in some small respect. And you see this in movies like Mean Girls. You see it as part of growing up and part of the formation of a student's identity. In fact, you can sometimes get to the situation where students think, parents will think, and school officials as well, that being bullying is a good thing for the student. In the sense, it makes them tougher, it makes them kind of grow up a little. And so, you know, these parents are complaining, we're distraught, 2 years he's been here and he hasn't been bullied once. Oh, sorry, still, yeah. And so, obviously, just based on that attitude, there's going to be a disinclination to intervene. But it's compounded by naive realism. As we sort of talked about in class, naive realism is the idea that every individual believes that they see the situation reasonably and objectively. And so, if you come across someone else who disagrees with your view, you'll conclude that either they're unreasonable or they're misinformed. In terms of bullying, what this becomes is, if a school official thinks that bullying is good, and a parent comes and says, hey, my student is being bullied, as Phoebe Prince's mom did, the school official might either see that the parent is unreasonable. In other words, they really are being too overprotective. They're helicopter parents. They just don't care about, they don't really care about their kids because they're just too much in this kind of overprotective, paternalistic mindset. Alternatively, they might think that the parent is simply misinformed, and that just translates into a lack of experience. If the school official looks at the parent and says, oh, well, you weren't bullying as a kid, and you know, you're a little weird for it, we'll make sure that your kid grows up normal. So as a result, like, when you have this like prevalent idea of what bullying is and how it helps students, it intersects with naive realism to basically have school officials being a lot more apathetic than otherwise we might think that they would be. And so moving on to students, we're going to talk about social identity theory, gender norms, and system justification theory. So social identity theory was introduced in 1979 to explain possible motivations for harassment, intimidation, and bullying. The core idea is that people draw their self-identity and pride out of the social groups that they're in. So then there's a tendency to aggrandize the social group that you're in while also distancing yourself from other groups. And so the strengthened identification that you have with your group, and then kind of adding that your group is the favorable one, fuels self-esteem. So people kind of have an incentive to make in-groups out-groups and sort of make your group look better. So in the Phoebe Prince case, we saw this sort of same division into groups and the same sort of aggrandizement and also disfavoring of other groups. In this case, the two divides were sort of the American good girls and then the Irish bad girls. And this was reflected in the slurs used, as we kind of saw in the internal situationists slides. The social identity theory was further fueled by gender norms, specifically, in this case, slut labeling. So as I believe the historians mentioned, Prince was romantically involved with a number of male students at the school. And so the female, or the girlfriends, or female friends of these males obviously were not very happy about this, and this expanded the chasm between the two groups. But it was also, the slut labeling went further because it basically gave a moral undertone to the whole distancing of one group from another. So in a sense, it was a type of blame frame. Basically that, yes, bullying is a bad thing, but she, by her disposition, deserved this. She was the one who acted like a slut, and as a result, you know, it's okay that we bully her. Really, it's a good thing. So gender norms really can kind of reinforce social identity theory. And so the last part, the last thing we analyzed within the context of students was system justification theory. And the idea here is that people, I mean, and we've gone through this in class, but people are motivated to defend and justify the status quo. And to do so, in some cases, the status quo is perceived as unjust. So individuals will rely on stereotypes to sort of pave over that, the dissonance that arises from those perceived injustices. In this particular case, and the other thing to bear in mind, of course, is also that disadvantaged groups tend to prefer advantaged groups and sort of look up to them and have kind of a hierarchical relationship with them. In the Phoebe Prince case, you can see this in a number of ways, but one of the more interesting, which we didn't necessarily look at in class, was that one of the girls in question, Ashley Long, who was one of the first girls to kind of break with Phoebe Prince, was relatively unpopular compared to Phoebe Prince, who when she came in was actually became very popular within the school. So initially, you know, so this disadvantaged girl, popularity-wise, kind of had to pave over that dissonance, and she did so by basically stereotyping Prince and saying like, well, yes, she's more popular, but I'm at least like good and wholesome, whereas she, again, bad girl. So moving on to parents. So we're going to go through two things with parents. That's reinforcing victimizing or aggressive behavior, and then also noticing behavior and reacting appropriately. So the first is that parental behavior matters a lot in determining whether both how bullies and victims and bystanders, of course, act. In general, parents who exhibit patterns of aggression at home and mimic kind of a bullying power dynamic often encourage bullying behavior in their students. Similarly, parents who aren't necessarily connected with their child, if there's neglect, if they don't teach their child to be independent and social, do put their child at risk of being bullied. And so in the Phoebe Prince case, it's a little unclear as to how her family life was, but we do know that her parents were divorced, and we also know that her mother was often away from the home. And these sorts of dynamics in her family life may have contributed to the fact that she was victimized. And then finally, the level of parental involvement in a child's school life also affects kind of the bullying dynamic. In general, it's pretty clear that parents are totally unaware of what's happening in school. Only 62% of victims tell their parents that they're being bullied, barely a little over half. And only 48% of bullies tell their parents, or at least give any indication that they might be bullying someone at school. There was a segment that unfortunately we don't have time to show, but that Dateline ran, where they basically took in parents who were convinced that their kids would never ever bully anyone else, and even as bystanders, they would quickly intervene and help the person who was being bullied. And they ran a study and basically had these parents watching on camera as their kids did nothing, right? I mean, and it was a total shock to all these parents because they really thought they would intervene. So parents are completely and totally unaware in many cases. And it's critical that parents really sort of look at the small signals and see whether their kids are involved in this behavior. We saw earlier that lots of kids will stay at home because they're afraid of being bullied. I mean, those are the things that parents need to pick up on. Moreover, when parents do notice stuff, they often don't report any bullying behavior for some of the reasons that we discussed earlier in terms of attributions and how bullying is perceived in society. And to wrap up, in Prince's case, it's true that her mother did have some signal that her daughter was being bullied and that she did communicate that to the school. At the same time, we also see a little bit of neglect, and that might have also kind of contributed to how the bullying dynamic was developed at school and its tragic result. And so next up, the tort doctrinalists are going to speak a little bit more about the legal framework behind bullying.
Great. So I'll be representing the tort doctrinalist group. And so we're going to take a look at this from a pretty black letter law approach. So it should be good. Okay. And so the two options that immediately strike us is the option of treating this as an intentional infliction of emotional distress and the option of treating this as a tort of negligence. So these are the two kind of paths we're going to go down in the analysis. And to our mind, to our thinking, the intentional infliction of emotional distress was initially the most appealing one. It seemed to make the most sense because that's really what happened here. That's what bullying was. It turns out that this tact has been brought before, and it's failed. And the most prominent case that we looked at was a case called Dornfried versus Berlin Board of Education. And this was an example of a football player who was being bullied by other football players. And the main problem with this attempt to frame bullying as this kind of tort, as a tort of intentional infliction of emotional distress, was that this type of tort requires, you guys remember Roger Schechter, the Barbary video, is that it requires committing an outrageous and extreme act beyond all bounds of decency. And if you think about the mechanics of what's happening here, the school did not commit the act. It was other football players who did. And so this kind of third-party vicarious liability does not obtain in this situation. So this is kind of a non-starter, at least according to our analysis. So we don't think that this is really going to be viable. Which brings us to the second option, which is a tort of negligence. Again, from, I guess, our sort of adjunct faculty member who taught us the black letter law part. So the tort of negligence. The four elements include duty, breach, causation, damages. And there's a little twist to negligence in the fact that damages don't need to be physical. They can be emotional. And so that, in this case, that's exactly what happened with Phoebe Prince's case. There was a can thrown at her at the very end, I believe on the day she committed suicide, when she hanged herself. But aside from that, it was verbal. It was primarily verbal. And so it's important to note that if you frame this as a tort of negligence, this is not a problem. The tort is still potentially viable. And so if you run through the elements, the duty would be that the school, the administrators, the teachers, however you want to think of it, have this duty to protect students from being bullied. The breach would be that this, peers, other students do in fact bully other students. And that would be the breach, and the causation would be that this is what causes the damages to the bullied student. And so most of these elements are satisfied in the case of bullying that we see in the Phoebe Prince case. The problem, the pressure point, the aspect of this that makes it a frontier tort is establishing duty. And there are two reasons why duty is a difficult element to establish in this kind of tort. One is the problem of sovereign immunity, and the second is foreseeability. So sovereign immunity, I believe, the Barbary video discussed a little bit, and it's basically what it sounds like it is. It's a form of immunization. So this immunity adheres to the administrators, faculty, people who work for the school, the employees. And the idea is that municipal employees have qualified immunity in the performance of acts wholly for the benefit of the public and that are supervisory in nature, which is a sort of legalistic way of framing what teachers, faculty members, what administrators in classes do. So this is a very obvious defense that a school would raise if this tort of negligence were brought in the case of bullying. It's worth thinking about the moral hazard that occurs when you have this kind of immunity, because the school is not, really being held liable for this kind of activity. So it's worth thinking about what incentives does this create, or what lack of incentives really does it create for them to be prudent to make sure that bullying doesn't happen. There are three exceptions to this idea of sovereign immunity, and we'll be picking up with this in a little bit. But right now, I just wanted to go over them quickly. The first is a liability imposed for discretionary acts involving malice, wantonness, or intent to injure. The second is liability imposed for discretionary acts when the statute provides a cause of action for failure to enforce certain provisions of the law. And the third exception to this exception is that there's liability imposed when circumstances make it apparent that his or her failure to act, that of an administrator, a teacher, a faculty person, would likely subject somebody to an identifiable person to imminent harm. And keep that in mind. That's what we're going to come back to as probably being the most viable exception that we can push on. And the second problem with establishing duty is that of foreseeability. And so this is a required sub-element of the element of duty. There's no duty without a certain minimal level of foreseeability. And one problem is the way, again, it's a sort of situational problem, but it's the way bullying is framed. It's the way it's thought of. It's not usually thought of as this kind of systematic, kind of deliberate, planned activity. Instead, it's thought of as something that's impulsive, that's unanticipated, that just kind of arises, not something that has much forethought. And therefore, schools typically present bullying as something that is unforeseeable. Moreover, schools tend to think of bullying as something that takes place underground. It's not something necessarily that happens right in the classroom, right in front of the principal's eyes, not right in front of the teacher. It happens when people are leaving school. It happens on the playground. It happens during football practice. But it's not something that's necessarily really conspicuous to the people who need to make it, need to be very aware of it in order to establish this tort. So now I'd like to follow up with the second part of this talk, or this part of the talk, which is what would a bullying tort look like? So given these problems that we just identified, given these obstacles to establishing a tort of negligence, what can we do? what's like the most plausible way of kind of pushing this and establishing this as a frontier tort. And so we think the tort of negligence, for reasons I just described, is the most viable option. We concluded that the intentional infliction of emotional distress is just probably not going to work because it's not an act committed by professors, by teachers, by anyone at the school. It's committed by students. So we're going to go with negligence as the way to approach this problem. And so in order to do this, we need to overcome the inability of plaintiffs to establish duty. That's really the main stumbling block. And so the two exceptions that we talked about are sovereign immunity and this problem of foreseeability. So talking about sovereign immunity, the main exception, the one that we think we can push back on, is failure to act would be likely to subject an identifiable person to imminent harm. And so in this case, Dornfried does offer some hope. In that case, the court ruled that any student attending class during school hours would count as an identifiable person. So really this is a question of what is an identifiable person? Who makes up this class and who's excluded from the class? And this isn't something that's settled. And it does become a problem in thinking about whom do we want to include and whom do we want to exclude. And so we think that this class should be expanded to include people like Phoebe Prince who weren't necessarily bullied in class, in the classroom, but nevertheless, there's just this kind of gut feeling that, yes, she counts as an identifiable person. So some ideas we had were students who are coming and going to and from school, any students on or off school grounds. Another one is maybe a student who's engaged in a school activity. But these all have their advantages and disadvantages. So I hate to bring up the Civ Pro, but it's like thinking about personal jurisdiction and just how far out can you push something and make it so that that student is still that the school is still liable for that student's activity. And as brought up before, cyberbullying, these other forms of bullying that take place, and it's really just kind of difficult to say, does this take place at school? Does it not? Should the school be liable for what students are doing? Where do we draw the line? It's a difficult problem. And then the second one is foreseeability, and specifically this idea that specific facts, having warned authorities that a particular threat exists and that it's been indicated to them that action on the part of the school could have prevented the injury. And so this we really thought did kind of exist in the Phoebe Prince case. The administrators kind of pussyfooted around this and said, well, not really. We didn't really know what was happening. We only found out about a week before she committed suicide, and we disciplined the students whom we knew about. We really did all that was reasonably expected. But if you buy the Phoebe Prince and her family side of the story of the facts, they really did know. They were informed. The mom had come in routinely to tell the principal, to tell the school that this was a problem. You need to do something about this. There's a specific quote that I don't want my daughter being harmed. Is there going to be harm that comes from these this other gang of kids that kind of bully her? What's going to happen? So we think that this is probably going to be a natural extension. We kind of, if we had to bet on this, we'd see it happening. And I think what we thought is that this will happen, but it will need to be kind of judge-made, judicial activism. So we think that eventually the pressure will be such that a judge at some point will say that in this case, all these factors come together and we're really going to push the boundaries of tort law. We're really going to say that, yes, there is a duty here and it is foreseeable so that a tort of negligence will be viable. And it's hard to say when that will happen, but our sense was that the pressure is there, the sort of public outrage is there, the knowledge is there, that it's sort of a matter of time. But we expect that judicially it will be handled through some ruling. I think that's it. So turn it over to the next group. Thank you.
Television has become one of the most pervasive mediums of communication in our recent history. The average American now watches more than 151 hours of television a month. Because the medium is so widely used, it is important to understand and know and understand the content that is being transmitted and the effects that it has on us. It is widely accepted that the media shapes public perceptions about significant political and social issues. The mass media brings simulated reality into our daily lives, and we find ourselves relying on these sources to provide a conceptualized image of the real world. Two prominent theories lend credence to this notion. Cultivation theory holds that popular media, such as television, has the power to influence our view of the world, and is primarily responsible for our perceptions of day-to-day notions and of reality. Another explanation of the influence of media, agenda-setting theory, places somewhat less emphasis on the impact of the media and on our perceptions of reality, and places more emphasis on what issues are actually being covered in the media. It holds that while the media doesn't necessarily tell us how to think, it tells us what to think about. Bullying in general, and the Phoebe case more specifically, are prominent examples of the media telling us what to think about. Chelsea will now discuss this more in depth.
The media analyst group, we kind of wanted to figure out where this shift in perceptions had come from us believing that bullying was kind of a lumpet, it was a rite of passage, you get bullied, you fight back, you grow up, to something that became sort of a public outrage. And what we kind of discovered is that the media shapes the way we perceive things that happen to us, and the media is very specific and selective in the way that they present these cases to us. Actual percentages of students that report being bullied frequently, which means more than once a week, and students that say that they bully more than once a week has remained pretty steady around 30% for about the past 30 years. The thing that has changed is the amount of students that are committing suicide as a result of bullying, but even that number is relatively small, with only 7% of teens committing suicide each year and only half of that being attributed to bullying. But what we've noticed is that the media has kind of narrowed that conversation to elements of teen suicide. So you don't hear about bullying in the media if there's not an element of suicide linked to it. And something that Naomi was talking about earlier, you hear about it a lot when there's a cyberbullying element. So we found that this narrowing led to people being outraged, people wanting to see something done when teens were seen killing themselves over school bullying or cyberbullying. So Victoria has compiled this montage of sort of media sensationalism in the bullying conversation.
The YouTube generation did not invent bullying, but has made it more visible. Thousands of no-holds-barred videos are posted online, and it appears the violence in them is getting worse.
Officials in Massachusetts believe there's been another tragic, deadly case of cyberbullying. A 15-year-old girl committed suicide, and it appears that she was being bullied online.
Bullying of Tyler Clementi led to Tyler's committing suicide. This indictment was sweeping, and it was the right thing to see.
Keeping him honest on bullying in America. Yet again, another teen has taken his own life, according to his parents, after being bullied for years. A 14-year-old boy this time. Time and time again on this program, we've reported on the problem of bullying in this country, and time again, we've announced the deaths of children. Children who should not be dead. Children whose loneliness and desperation, not just in the last few minutes of their life, but often in the years leading up to their deaths, is simply heartbreaking to imagine. This is Jamie Rodemeyer, just 14 years old, a freshman at Williamsville North High School in Buffalo, New York. Jamie routinely blogged about his troubles. Just 11 days ago, he wrote something online. He said, "I always say how bullied I am, but no one listens. What do I have to do so people will listen?" 1 week later, this past Sunday, Jamie committed suicide.
Joining us now from St. Louis is Tina Meyer, whose daughter Megan committed suicide after being cyberbullied. And with her, a 17-year-old Brittany Jordan, who is a cyberbully victim herself and also tried to take her own life. Ladies, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you.
You're welcome. Brittany, let me begin with you. When you hear Phoebe's story this morning, do you think to yourself, that was almost me?
Yes, I do. It makes me hurt inside.
The door.
I saw my baby there hanging.
Completely unacceptable. Within a week and a half, two 11-year-old boys driven to commit suicide, both enrolled at new schools, both bullied and taunted, labeled as gay.
I want you to meet a little boy named Asher Brown. He lived in Texas. He was 13 years old. And I say was in the past because he shot himself in the head last Thursday. His stepfather found his little body crumpled up at the bottom of a closet. Asher's mom and stepfather say that he was bullied to death, that he killed himself after being constantly harassed by 4 classmates. Picked on, they say, because he was small, because he didn't wear the kind of popular clothes that other kids wore, and because he was gay.
You've heard of bullies, but you probably haven't seen anything as bad as this. A teenager harassed so unmercifully, his parents are going to court to get it to stop. We'll meet him and his mother.
The problem of bullying in schools. We've covered the deaths of a number of kids who've actually taken their own lives after being relentlessly bullied. You may remember Carl Joseph Walker Hoover. He's there on the left. He was in the 6th grade. Students taunted him, saying he acted gay. He hanged himself. He was just 11 years old.
I did everything that a parent is supposed to do. I chose a good school. I joined the PTO. I went to every parent-teacher conference. I called the school regularly, and I brought the bullying problem to their staff's attention. The school did not act.
My days may not seem so long. Oh, Lord, how they all drag on. The love
Nice shirt.
Bullying and teasing has become an epidemic. None of us can stay silent any longer.
It's time to stop humiliating people because they're different.
Bullying has to stop, and it has to start with you.
Think about somebody beating up on you or bullying you for some choice that you've made in your life.
We need to stop thinking it's okay to make someone feel bad about who they are.
Teasing someone because they're different from you isn't funny.
You may not think that what you say can have an effect on someone, but it does.
If you're a bystander, make sure to step in and, help out.
Be a hero. Stand up for someone who needs your help. Don't let bullying take another kid's life.
If you see it, try to stop it, report it.
If you're being teased and you feel alone, I want you to know you're not alone.
If you need help, reach out.
There are people out there ready to help.
To get help or to find out how to help, go to lntv.com and please be kind to one another.
As you can see, bullying has transformed into the dominant narrative in our media. We have headlines ranging from bully to death to now it's a bullying epidemic. We have a whole host of individuals who are discussing and raising awareness on the issue. We see that the media can and does wield a lot of influence. It can and often does decide what is reported, and these stories are assimilated and accommodated into the emotional and cognitive fabric of individual viewers. How the media chooses to report and to comment on particular events and issues will inevitably influence the thinking of many, including policymakers and congressional members. The media then has strong policy implications, which the next group will now discuss. Thank you.
Okay, so Arun, Jake, and I are going to present on our economic model of bullying and what this entails for what kind of policy we might want to have. So I know you guys that want to never see these again, but here they are. So we have a game theory model of bullying. And what happens here is our full model has 3 actors. So there's the school, the bully, and the victim. And just to give you an idea of how this works is at the core of it, you have this bully, and he has a choice whether to bully or not bully, right? And the victim doesn't really get a choice because they're being picked on. And the payoffs here, you can see the left side is the bully, then the right side is the victim. And basically, the bully will choose to bully because he gets some kind of satisfaction or some kind of enjoyment or some kind of psychological benefit from bullying, but at a big cost to the victim. And we can see that those costs to the victim can be really large. What matters here is not the exact numbers, but the relative proportions here. And basically, the idea is that if you just leave the bully to do what they want, we're going to get this socially inefficient outcome. So if we go to the next slide. You can see that the general rule tends to be a negligence rule. Like you saw that if the school is aware that someone's being bullied and they don't do anything, then they might become liable, right? So this is kind of general rule here. And at this stage of the model, we're assuming that everyone is a rational actor. And Jake and Arun are going to relax this assumption to make it more realistic with like the teenage mindset and what might be going through the head of the bully, because they're not necessarily rational. But for now, we're going to assume that the bully is rational, right? And the school has a choice to create some kind of policy or not have any policy. And we have two policies here to kind of show an ex post and an ex ante policy. And they can punish the victim, which means that they're going to impose a cost, punish the bully, and impose a cost after the bullying has occurred. So this is trying to deter a bully by imposing costs on their behavior. And the other one is a monitoring or maybe kind of like education policy, which is trying to do something ex ante to stop bullying from occurring in the first place. And you can see that if you have this kind of policy, that the bully is going to be enjoined from bullying, based like the Bolton Docks sheriff. There will be no bullying because you're able to prevent the bullying in the first place. And what you see is here with the negligence rule, you can see the payoffs here go from school bully victim. And what happens is that negative 200 you see for the school is kind of their costs for creating their administrative costs for having having someone set up detention or something like that. So we think that the punishment is pretty straightforward for the school, but that the monitoring costs here or like having an education policy, we left it at X because we think it's very variable, like the extent to which what kind of program they might have to have in order to prevent bullying from occurring, and also so you can compare the cost of the two policies, right? And we can see here that with the negligence rule, if there's no policy, the school doesn't do anything, well, obviously they're going to be held liable and they're going to have to compensate the victim, which is why they're negative 1,000. But if they enact one of the policies, then well, they're not going to be held liable. And here, just given that punishment is probably cheaper, they're probably going to enact a punishment policy. The punishment policy imposes a cost to the bully. The bully no longer gains enough benefit from bullying, so is not going to bully, and you'll see an equilibrium up there. Or if monitoring is cheaper, they'll choose this, and the bully will be enjoined. And in either case, with the negligence rule and rational actors, you're going to see that there's no bullying. And I'm going to turn it off to Jake.
Yes, we love this Boats and Docks rip-off model because it makes our lives easy. We assume away all the problems. It's so easy and so simple to just image everything. But believe it or not, we do care about reality. And we're going to address one of those issues by introducing a little bit of behavioral economics and what we call high future discounting. And what that is that people systematically underestimate cost or benefit that happen in the future. It's like asking a little kid, 1 marshmallow right now or 2 marshmallows in 5 minutes. So in this case, the bully, we know, are teenagers and are not. So they don't correctly appreciate what's going to happen to them if they bully, because, hey, the victim, the swanny little kid, is right here. The bully can punch him in the face right now, get the enjoyment. And hey, what if the punishment happens? It's in the future. Bully's not going to appreciate that. He's not going to correctly, strategically calculate all the payoffs before he punches someone in the face. So we introduced that into the model by saying that even if we have the punishment policy, the bully is going to perceive the payoff of bullying the kid as still being better for himself. Whether that's correct or not, all that matters is what the bully thinks. All that matters is what the bully expects before he makes the decision. So in that case, even if the school has the punishment policy, the bully is going to choose to bully, which leads to a socially inefficient outcome. And if we think about the school's incentive in this case, does the school have the incentive to choose the monitoring policy? Well, not necessarily, because under the negligence scheme, all the school needs to do is implement some kind of policy to escape any degree of liability. And in that case, if the monitoring policy is more costly than the punishment policy, it wouldn't bother. So, if implementing a monitoring policy is significantly more costly or expensive or just bothersome to the school, it may not happen. So under the currently widely used negligence rule, this model predicts that we may not end up in a socially efficient outcome. And Arun will discuss a better model.
So as, Jake and Paul sort of set up, we have a problem. Our current model might not be providing the right incentives. So how can we change it? And one idea is, instead of letting schools skate by on a negligence policy, which means that as long as they have something in place, they're not going to be liable, what if we impose strict liability on schools, essentially, a no excuses policy for the schools? If bullying happens, they have to compensate the victim. In this case, if they have a punishment policy, and again, we're still assuming here that the bullies aren't going to be completely rational, that even if there's a punishment, they're still going to go ahead and bully, the school's going to be held liable. So now the school doesn't want to just have a punishment policy anymore because they know that's going to impose costs on them. So instead, they're going to go through this monitoring policy, which hopefully leads to the enjoyment of bullying, and enjoyment, and will lead to the socially efficient outcome, which is to not have bullying. And again, one of the key assumptions here is that the cost to the school of monitoring this policy is less than the cost that's going to be imposed on the victim. Because if it was cheaper for the school to just let someone be bullied and pay that cost each time, then honestly the cheapest thing would be the school to have no policy. But we're kind of assuming here, because we do care about the kids and we do see very horrific consequence from bullying, that any expense the school faces is probably going to be less than what's going to happen to the victim. So to kind of include this, if we assume this high discounting, which is, I think most people here would agree, a very reasonable assumption, then it's really strict liability which provides the correct incentive. Negligence may or may not provide the correct incentives, and we think that, experience shows it typically doesn't. But there are other assumptions. As much as, we love economic models here, as much as we love sort of simplifying things out, we do have to acknowledge there are limitations to this model. One of the big ones is we're assuming that the policies are mutually exclusive and 100% effective. Obviously, the school can pursue both. They can pursue punishment and, a monitoring policy to prevent bullying. But the second part is what's more interesting. If we all know, kind of intuitively, that no matter what the school does, there probably will still be some bullying in place. Is it fair to hold the schools liable if they put their best effort, if they do, their best to have a really good policy in place, and bullying still happens? Is that the school's fault? Is it fair to hold the schools liable, in that sense? And if you don't think so, then maybe strict liability isn't the right rule here. Another thing is we're not taking into account any liability for the bully. I mean, they are kids, but we still feel at some level that they should be held responsible for what they do. Does this model, which pushes all the blame onto the schools, does that prevent, the bullies from internalizing the risk of their activity and, taking into account those consequences? And lastly, this model doesn't take into account the family. I mean, we've seen from the external situations presentation that family and the family situation plays a big role in whether or not someone's going to go off and be a bully. And maybe we want to put leave some liability off the school to encourage the families to take some responsibility and make sure, pay more attention to their kids, make sure their kids aren't picking up aggressive behavior and things like that. So while this model is certainly a useful tool for understanding it, we do realize there are a lot of simplifications here that maybe, make strict liability less applicable rule because either it's not fair or it's not really efficient to hold the school entirely responsible for every single instance of bullying. All right, and now we're going to move on to off a model and more real-world applications of how these policies have come up.
So you guys have just had a lot of economics thrown at you. I want you to now put on your policy caps. We're going to start to think about solutions. This is actually a picture of a bus accident. This is not bullying. But I want you to think about it as if you were the superintendent who gets the call that this just happened. So what are you thinking about? Shout something out. What are you thinking? If you're the superintendent who just found out this happened in your small school district. Yeah, how did this happen? Who's drunk? Okay. Yeah, how did this risk happen? But you're probably also at some level thinking this is a freak accident. It's an isolated event. Now, the problem with that type of response for bullying is that, as we've seen from Naomi's conversation, as well as The Economist, as well as what everyone's been saying, is that bullying is not the same as a freak accident like a bus wreck. It's something that very fundamentally superintendents and legislatures have to reconceptualize. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to achieve these two aims of preventing bullying from happening and holding the relevant actors accountable. So you can go to the next slide. You can see that Columbine, as our historians discuss, was kind of the advent of state legislation that addressed bullying. You can see that there's just been a rapid increase in laws in different states that have incorporated issues of bullying. You can go to the next slide. Cyberbullying, oh, you can't see part of the slide. Cyberbullying is now prohibited in most state legislations, but you can see that it's done so to varying degrees, and in some, in 10 out of 46, it's not actually mentioned. Go to the next slide. So Naomi discussed the relevant federal legislation a lot. The big conclusion or takeaway here is that federal law has not been effective to provide either recompense for the victims or actually create schools changing their policies. And she was very frank about that. I think what she didn't say is how much her case really is at that frontier pushing on these school actors. Under Title IX, under the standard that she referred to, the Davis standard, it basically doesn't allow for any type of liability on the schools unless they meet that, the words that she said, which is coming out of that case Davis, deliberately indifferent to sexual harassment of which they have actual knowledge that is so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it can be said to deprive the victim of access to education. So you guys can see that's a super high standard, right? That basically means that the school has to know about what's going on and almost actively enable it to happen. But the reality is that no cases have come up that have actually been able to meet that standard. So you can go to the next slide. So if federal policy or impact litigation isn't working, how do we make the system of state legislation work? So you guys need to be thinking about what level of control you think the state legislature should have in this. And you can see there's 4 different variations that different states have basically used, giving some control to local communities in deciding what bullying looks like and how to enforce it, all the way up to like legislators in their Capitol Hill houses in the state level deciding this is what bullying is. But the real question here is, what is the most effective way? So you can go to the next slide. I want you guys to think about all of the relevant stakeholders, particularly the agencies as being able to define bullying, the school districts as being the ones who need to report it, and even like the parents themselves in terms of how they're participating in that process. So you can go to the next slide. The components that are currently in legislation, you can see most legislation does include some type of sanction for bullying. 42 out of 46 states do have that. They do have definitions of bullying. 45 states have that. And they do usually have some type of scope that kind of defines what bullying is. But you'll notice that there's some things, like for example, having mental health referrals that could actually help the victim and bully, get better. That's really rare. You can see that legal remedies are very, very rarely provided. So you can think about these as areas where we could improve upon the policy. So if we want to talk about the key policy areas, these 6 right over here, defining, reporting, investigating, having records, sanctions, and mental health are probably the 6 key areas that are coming from the Department of Education is the most important to think about. You can see some examples here. That's what reporting looks like, what investigating could look like, what sanctioning could look like. But you might be thinking, what about prevention? That's the thing that we keep on coming back to as a theme. How do we stop this from happening beforehand? So we're going to give you one more option besides just strict liability. It's kind of a variation on it. And it's coming out of research from Dr. Weedle, the University of Missouri. Basically what he says is school climate is the biggest predictor of whether or not bullying is going to happen. And he breaks school climate into 2 different factors. The idea of social control, meaning do schools have rules and are they enforcing those rules? And then second, this idea of social cohesion. That's what you'd be thinking about if you're thinking about what's the dynamic of interaction between the teachers and students and between students themselves looking like. So, with that in mind, here's the recommendation. It's basically that statute does need to create liability. But in order to give schools an incentive to actually implement that standard, we need to have carrots and sticks. So, a state outlines its policy goals. If the schools implement the policy, meaning if they include anti-bullying prevention techniques and they do all of those other 6 prioritized elements, then they are only held to that negligence standard. But if they don't implement anti-bullying prevention techniques, then not only are they going to be held to strict liability, like Arun was talking about, but they're also going to have the additional presumption that they are liable. So you can think about some of the different concerns that that might raise, including, do schools have an incentive to report if bullying is occurring? You can think probably not, since if they're saying that bullying doesn't occur, then they look like they're in compliance. And you can also think about, how does that control or not control for local communities' needs in terms of what they think should be defining bullying, or whose role it is, parents or school, in order to stop that. And I want you guys to think about other concerns. So just because of the sake of time, we're probably gonna, you can see this is the idea of the carrot, that if schools don't implement, then we have the stick of liability. And so now I want you to start to think about what might a good school policy look like. And to give you one example.
Okay, guys, so what I was hoping to do is go over an example of a fairly successful anti-bullying policy at a school, but I know it's really important for us to have discussion too, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but we do have all the information on this available if anyone's really interested in it. So we were lucky enough for a school district to allow us to go through their anti-bullying policy as well as the curriculum that they teach their students, so you can see that this is their mission statement and the different things that it addresses. And so the school lays out specific procedures for reporting. Anyone can report bullying to any member of the staff that works at the school, and it has to be fed up the chain immediately. After reporting occurs, there's an investigation of the complaint, and there's specific responses to the investigation that can include various sanctions and different reactions, such as giving notice to other schools, responding to the bully, disciplining the bully, and most importantly, restoring a sense of safety to the community. The school district also implements professional development for its staff as part of its prevention. And finally, it incorporates parent education and resources, as well as a district-wide anti-bullying curriculum. And we're going to dive in really quickly to an example of that curriculum at the middle school level. So this is an example of a little bit of the curriculum that's presented to the 6th grade in the middle school that we were looking at. So on day one, the students first take an anti-bullying survey, and they also look, or a bullying survey, and they also look at definitions and examples of terms that around this issue of bullying. And then on day two, they're introduced to their equity coordinator, which is the same thing as their Title IX coordinator. They watch a video about being bullied, and they have a class discussion. The discussion continues, and the students also engage in various role-playing activities. And then eventually there is a conclusion to the anti-bullying unit. And here's just some examples of certain questions that kids see on their bullying survey, as well as definitions and the role-playing activities that kids go through. Finally, the kids are also taught about the actual law here in Massachusetts, which was actually instituted shortly after the Phoebe Prinz case. And also at the 7th grade level, students are sort of taught different ways to be more assertive and more active in the anti-bullying role of their community. They're actually taught about the bystander effect that we talked about earlier in the presentation. And here are just a few examples of that. They're taught what a bystander is, how to be an active, good bystander as opposed to a passive, bad bystander. And they're taught about how it's their responsibility to have a good, solid school community. And they're also taught about why empathy is important in being a good, active bystander. Keep going. Okay, so finally, the last thing on the school end is, if our goal really is to prevent bullying and keep it at a very minimum, assuming that the school has taken as much of a role as possible to diminish bullying, our last question is, then should the liability be shifted to someone else? If the school has done 100% everything that it can possibly do, is there still room for liability on parents or the bullies themselves?
Thank you. Thanks, guys. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. We're kind of pressed for time, so I'm just kind of gonna wrap it up and bring it back home to class. So far in this class, we've learned about situationism and dispositionism as if they're two completely distinct categories. But in the case of Phoebe Prince, we've seen how they converge, they influence each other, and they can even have synergistic effects. So Ms. Prince, she had a certain disposition to the extent that it was influenced by her situation. We don't know to the extent that her disposition caused her to seek out certain relationships and situations. That's also something to think about. And with regard to the other people involved, the school administrators, the bullies, bystanders, there are also situational and dispositional factors coming into play there. As our situationists have pointed out, there are also psychological principles that can help us understand them. So it's really hard to point a finger of blame. Who's really at fault here? Is it the bullies? Is it the people who stand by and watch it happen and do nothing? Is it, neglectful parents? We don't know. It's a hard question, and it's a very complicated picture that goes beyond the simplistic one that the media likes to present, where the bully is the evil bad guy and the victim is this passive, innocent character. And with regard to social media, while bullying is not as physically violent as it used to be, it's still just as dangerous, possibly even more so, because now with cyberbullying, it's inescapable, it's pervasive. You can't leave school and be free from it. You're kind of always subjected to this bullying. So that's something to keep in mind. And the traditional idea of vigilante justice, while we all wish that bullies or people being bullied could stand up for themselves, that they could be the ones to push Regina George in front of the bus, in reality, it's just a fantasy. It doesn't work. It's not effective. Not only that, vigilante justice is just the kind of thing that our legal system is designed to prevent. So with that, it's important to think about the kind of reform that's needed. And in this case, we're talking about policy reform. So I'll walk you through the 3 different policy recommendations that we've come up with, and maybe through our discussion, you can kind of generate some of your own before we put it to a vote. So there's strict liability, which says if the school does not take steps to alleviate a bullying situation, it will be held to a strict liability standard. That's what The Economist presented, pretty cut and dry. There's the carrot and the stick model that Elizabeth presented. So if the school implements a state-mandated anti-bullying policy, it will be held to a negligence standard, and if it does not, strict liability. Then there's shifted liability, where if the school does everything to the best of its ability, the liability will shift to the parents of the bullies and the bullies themselves. All right, so I'm going to start passing this out, and then if there are any questions before you put it to a vote.
I can talk loudly too.
Okay.
Just out of curiosity, was there any discussion in the group about where liability might fit in the cyberbullying context for host websites like Facebook or Twitter, or the ones who sort of provide the forum in which this bullying can occur?
Does anyone want to answer that?
Not a lot of, I don't think a lot of cross-group discussion, but there's certainly some ideas. One, sites like Facebook, which do give schools some measure of control, schools should still be held liable. And in other cases where, a big aspect of this out-of-school bullying is that it creates an environment within the school that's, dangerous for the student or harmful for students' mental health. So insofar as the school has control over that, you can put liability on the school. Obviously, there's liability on the bully themselves and the family in that situation, because parents are, in some senses, responsible for the action of their children. So you can use a similar lens to evaluate it based on, who you think has kind of controlled that situation, who you think could prevent it, and things like that.
And this is a little off from what you'd asked, but one thing I sort of wanted to point out that we went through fairly quickly, and I think this is somewhere where there's a little bit of a break from the ACLU and the speaker that we had earlier. At least in Massachusetts, a lot of schools really are clamping down on bullying that occurs outside of school grounds, as well as online through Facebook, whether it happened at school or not. So the district that we looked at has a policy in place to address bullying and cyberbullying, whether or not it happened in school.
So it seems from your presentation that right now bullying's pretty heavily underregulated, you could say. There are not a lot of laws that are kind of out there that are at least effective or programs or policy implementations. But was there ever a concern raised about, I guess you could say, like over-regulating or over-criminalizing it to the extent that, like, kids do call each other names, right? So if some kid calls somebody else weird, that all of a sudden now these policies kick in? Or to what extent is there a concern that maybe is going above and beyond the call of duty, per se?
But I think that there's this kind of, we talked about this before, well, where's the boundary? Where does personal responsibility come into play? But there is an actual definition of bullying. Bullying isn't I just one day called you weird. It's repeatedly calling you weird every day, knowing it bothers you. So I think the fact that there is a definition of bullying, it's not like students are going to start being sanctioned for just everyday name calling.
Actually, to add to that a bit, there is quite a bit of variety, though, in the definitions. There are currently 48 states that have legislation about bullying at schools, and they don't all have the same definition. And also, there was a Department of Education study done in 2011, which we looked at a lot for the policy wonks, and it actually said that there is a trend toward criminalization and getting criminal enforcement and law enforcement involved in bullying cases. So I actually do think that that's an issue, and whether it's having positive consequences or not, I think is unclear. It's not really being systematically measured and monitored, most like the scientific way.
Yeah, I was just going to add to this response about the whole situation about people taking it too seriously. It kind of goes toward a big kind of policy debate that was going on at Slate around the depression that Phoebe Prince had. It was around that case specifically, and there actually is a legitimate policy concern around what exactly was the triggering factor in things like bullying or like suicides. So I think it's certainly being addressed in legal spheres, but it's something that I haven't seen a conclusion reached on.
So I have a kind of similar question. When I was reading your paper, it reminded me of the Petco cases and strict liability that we talked about at the beginning, and just kind of when we were all like, oh, well, they can't make Petco strictly liable because then they won't let people bring their dogs anymore. And I was just wondering what your research turned up or what you guys were thinking, if schools would really like cut back on allowed interactions between students and extracurricular activities and things like that because they were worried about strict liability from from interactions.
Hello. I guess there's two ways to like respond to that. The first is zero tolerance as a policy. You guys know zero tolerance, like the idea that, you know, if you bring drugs or weapons into school, you get booted out. The same has actually been applied to bullying, to then like kick the bullies out. Obviously that has horribly detrimental consequences for the bullies' educational outcomes, right? So you can see that like that's part of the problem. Does that answer your question, or was it?
Okay.
I don't know. I was not on the policy team. I think that's really speculative. So I don't know that anybody really would have delved into that. I think that it would just kind of manifest itself more, though, in Elizabeth's no tolerance policy. I don't know that they would actually cut activities or try to limit students interacting with each other. I think it would manifest it more with like that punishment of bullies.
That makes sense. I was just going to also say something that Elizabeth did point out. So strict liability is not the standard right now, but one concern that we raised in our part is that maybe it would encourage schools to underreport bullying, so that would be like a negative consequence, for instance.
Okay, I have a question regarding the actual bullies. They mentioned, well, you guys mentioned in your presentation that these kids also come from fairly rough backgrounds, or they might be neglected or abused. In the policy recommendations, is there any counseling for the bully as well?
That can certainly be one of them.
So Again, part of the district policy that we looked at involves disciplining the bullies if necessary, but almost every situation, or I think every situation, involves first counseling the bullies, more so than disciplining, and disciplining only if it's considered absolutely necessary. So in that one particular model, it's definitely taken into account. And I think in more possibly progressive areas, Massachusetts tends to be sort of on the cutting edge where this tragedy occurred and there was such a reaction to it, that seems to be the case here. But it's, as Cecilia said, there's so many different policies and different state approaches to it that it's extremely varied.
All right. Are there any more burning questions? Can we put this to a vote? All right, Stephen.
This is just response to like the overall all the policies and programs that have been presented. The feeling that I get is that even though we have gone from sort of like asking the victim in the 70s, the media portraying like victims as having to respond and assigning control to a victim, but still that seems to persist now. Even though we assign more control to schools, we still don't seem to assign that much control to the bullies themselves. And I don't know if this is because we're trying to like, all these are targeted towards like getting damages from schools, and that's why that addressing the bullies themselves is less represented in this presentation. Or would you guys agree with my sort of characterization that little control is still yet to be assigned to bullies, and still bullies are seen as victims of their situations, more or less?
So I think part of the reason why the focus has kind of been shifted to the schools, and our speaker today touched on that, was the compensatory damages. Yeah, I think the fact that the school as an institution is probably better equipped to take that on versus an individual. But then on the other hand, something that Elizabeth touched on was that these like zero tolerance policies that focus on like purely punitive measures aren't necessarily effective, and they lead, I think, to pretty serious consequences where if you're expelling or suspending or taking, depriving the student of educational opportunities, it kind of leads to this down spiral of like behavioral issues that later compound the situation. Whereas kind of our policy recommendations focused more on the preventative element. And to kind of speak to the theme of the class situation versus dispositionism, the line between bully and victim is one that's blurred pretty often, as we saw kind of with the Phoebe Prince case. Like she, in Ireland, I think back home, also bullied people, and I'm not sure actually to what extent she bullied people in the US also, but it's not always very cut and dry. And sorry, I just topped off my train of thought. So yeah, that's why we focus more kind of on preventative measures, on programs that foster kind of collaboration and like foster kind of positive relationships between students to kind of nip that in the bud rather than punishment. So kind of I think of focusing more on liability on the student is a model that kind of reflects what we've talked a little bit about, the penal institution and like incarceration rates. That our penal institution, it's very punitive in nature, not rehabilitative in nature. So you're not actually speaking to what's causing this person to act this way. I don't know if that answered your question.
Okay, great. Let's put it to a vote. So can you give them the options so that... Okay. And we don't want to limit you to these three, so we're going to make a fourth option that's kind of a combination of whatever. Yeah.
Or is this one option, I would say? Because this feels not like three.
I think, are you noticing that the first one says if the school does not take steps to alleviate bullying, which seems like that's the same as number two?
Yeah.
I think that phrase not to be there, I think, or correct me if I'm wrong,
sorry.
but you were just saying.
That's supposed to, the first policy is more supposed to be no excuse. So it's supposed to be regardless if the school takes steps to alleviate a bullying situation, it will be held with scrivener's error.
Okay, that's
Okay, then are you ready?
Do people get the difference? Like the first one, or do you want to say that?
Yeah, all right. So Yeah, the first one again, no excuses. Again, bullying happens, the school is liable, no matter what policies they have.
The carrot and stick, you can call an enforcement inducing or a bully discouraging policy inducing penalty default. I'll draw it on the board.
Okay, who votes for number 1?
Oh, wow. Okay. Can we get a count going? Okay. Who votes for number 2? And number 3? Number 4? Okay. We don't want to limit you, so. All right, then number 2 wins. Congratulations.